Okay, well, thanks, crew, for coming. My name is Maia. This is Chris. We'll get into our intros in a sec, but thanks very much for coming out bright and early for this talk. So this talk is a TDD in accessibility. So just out of curiosity, who here came because they saw accessibility in the title? Yeah, exactly. Who came because they saw TDD in the title? And who here was like, TDD accessibility, like that's the intersection, that's my jam?
Accessibility.
Sorry?
Accessibility from.
Yeah, cool, okay, cool. That's cool, just out of curiosity. So, sorry, just start the timer. When you're doing either accessibility or TDD in your day-to-day, have you ever encountered, we can't do it right now, it's too expensive, or we don't have the time to do it, or we don't have the training, or it's too hard, or my favorite, we'll do it next iteration, next sprint, next release. Yeah, so when Chris and I have been talking about our respective domains, TDD and accessibility, we both found that one of the things that they have in common is that they're both often put in the too hard bucket. But there's also other things about the two of them that have in common. Both of them really support quality, robust code, refactorable code, and ultimately both of them are fundamentally human-centered approaches to building software and code.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of people here are already familiar with the basic concepts, but just in case, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they actually are. So test-driven development is a coding methodology or a design methodology made up of 3 simple steps. The first one is you write a failing test first. Before you write any code, you write the test that is going to exercise that code, and it's going to fail because you haven't written the code that's going to make it work yet. Then you make the test pass, and you try and do that in the simplest, easiest way possible, committing whatever sins you need to just to get it going green. And then you have this opportunity to refactor and clean things up. And that's why you actually end up with better quality code, because you have this opportunity to continuously refactor when you've just got the smallest amount of mess that you could possibly have. Now, when we're working in the front end, particularly, which is where accessibility is most relevant, I like to think about that first step not just as writing a failing test, but as expressing the user interaction intent in a test. And the reason that, one of the reasons that TDD and accessibility go so well together is that the accessibility standards that are there to make websites and browsers more accessible actually make it a lot easier for you to express that user intent in your tests. And in particular, today we're going to be using a tool called Playwright. I'm assuming if you work in this space, you're probably familiar with it. It's a sort of a front-end testing framework, and we'll be using that to do exactly this, to express the user interaction intent in a test and then go through the TDD cycle.
When it comes to accessibility, obviously it's about people. In Australia, 1 in 5 people identify as having a disability. Put in another context, that's 5 million people, or again, in other words, that's the entire population of Melbourne. And that is a minimum number, because that's people who have ticked that off of a box. So when we think about accessibility, yes, it certainly benefits those who we might traditionally think of. But we can expand that thinking as well. For example, those who are neurodiverse might not tick off on a box that they have a disability in a census form, for example. Or maybe you suspect that you're neurodiverse, but you didn't get an official diagnosis. So you're like, can I tick it off a box? I'm not sure. Definitely, the accessibility features that we include benefit our neurodiverse friends. But there's also temporary or situational disabilities. So for example, I'm a right-handed person, I'm even holding the clicker in my right hand. If I break my right hand or my right arm, that's going to impact the way that I use technology. So hopefully I'll heal from that injury, but for the time being, I am disabled, but I wouldn't necessarily, again, tick that off of a box. And then finally, we have our older population. So 49% of people aged 65 plus have a disability. So that's almost half. But again, somebody who looks at their phone really far away and has to zoom in a lot might not necessarily identify as disabled. But of course, as we age, our eyesight gets weaker, our dexterity gets weaker, our cognition is just a natural part of aging. And so again, when we're considering accessibility, we're also considering older people as well. All right, so before we dive into it, who in the world are we anyway? Why are we even talking about this? Why should you listen to us and what we have to say?
Yeah, so my name's Chris. Historically, I've been very much working in the technology space, so co-founding a few startups in Australia as the CTO. These days I work as a coach, coaching CTOs, but also I really love software. I like writing it, I like designing it, so I train and consult in domain-driven design and test-driven development, and I do a lot of community work, run a meetup, do a lot of open source development, and a lot of this kind of speaking around these topics. The thing that all of that stuff has in common that I've found over my career is that I'm all about the technology being a real driver of the business outcomes. And in order for that to happen, you have to understand your users and the value that you're delivering to them. And so it's really at that intersection of, yeah, I love technology, but not for its own sake. It's about what can we do with it and who are we doing it for.
Nice, and like I said, I'm Maia, so I am a digital accessibility specialist. I've certified in that realm. I'm a nerd about it, I really love it, so much so that I decided to start my own company doing it, LF Accessibility. We're based in New Zealand, but we do work across New Zealand and Australia. My background is as a developer, so that's why we decided we wanted to collaborate, because that shared interest in building software, but building software for people. And like Chris, I'm also a community participant and advocate when it comes to accessibility, doing meetups and speaking and all that kind of stuff. I'll toss it over to you. So the reason why Chris is standing over there is we're going to be doing live coding, so he's going to be driving. So he's not just like scared of you.
Yeah, so let's get into what we're going to be doing today. We're actually going to be live coding out a front-end page, and it actually connects to a talk I gave yesterday about test-driven development and domain-driven design. I see a couple of people that were there. And what we did in that talk was we drove out the design of a domain that's for student registration at a university, a pretty simplified version of it. And we went through this whole journey to get there, but what we ended up with was this workflow. This is called an event storming workflow, and we kind of see that, we set up rooms, we include courses in catalogs, students register and then they enroll in courses, and then we have this scheduling algorithm that allocates rooms to courses and whatnot. So if you're curious about that, check out the video of the talk yesterday. But what we're going to be focusing on today is a particular interaction in this journey, and it's this one where the students are enrolling in the course. So they come to a page, they need to choose the course they want to enroll in, and then enroll in it, and we're going to be exploring all the different aspects of that simple interaction through using test-driven development and focusing on accessibility. So now it's time to dig into the code. So let me find my IDE. So is this zoomed in enough? Can everyone read the code there? There is some room at the front, so if you're finding it a bit difficult, feel free to come down. The way that we're going to do this, I'm not actually going to type every keystroke. That would take a long time. I would make a lot of mistakes. You would think very poorly of me. But what we've got is the journey of evolving this code base baked into a Git repository, and we're stepping through each of the steps, and I'm going to explain them as we go. Down here on the left, we've got our tests running in a loop. We're starting with just a simple test that asserts nothing, but just confirms that everything's working. In this case, Playwright is the test framework, and we're building out what these days is pretty standard, like a Next.js app with Tailwind. So I know there's probably opinions about Next.js and opinions about Tailwind. Not really the focus of the talk today, but that is what we're using. So we've got a page here. It doesn't look like much. There's no content. And we've got a simple test that does nothing. So let's do the first thing. So what I said, we write a test, and then we make it pass. So let's add a test. I'm going to step forwards through the code. We're going to add a very first test, which is that the page has a title. So in Playwright, we're just saying page, go to this URL, and expect it to have a title, university registration, which of course it doesn't yet, because we didn't do anything. And so now I find out I've got the red case. So let's go back in here to our thing and add the page. Oh, sorry, it's not even on that. Here it is. So the title now is set to university registration. So I scroll to the wrong part there. I'll go backwards and show you. It was create next app, because that's what comes out when you're out of the box, which goes red. And then let's step forwards, change it to university registration, and now our test is going to pass. So that's very simple, but it just kind of shows that really lightweight, simple test, simple implementation to make the thing work. So let's add another test. We're going to add not just the page title, but a heading on the page. Expect page get by role heading with university registration. We don't have a heading yet. So it's not there. We're going to talk a bit more about roles as we go, but you can sort of get the sense here that what we're doing is saying, look for this element that has a role of heading with university registration. We're going to expect that it's visible, and of course it's not, so we get a red case. So let's go back into the page and add a heading. So now we've got an H2 heading in there, and now that's passing, and we're good to go. So Maia, we've gotten started here. We haven't talked much about accessibility.
Yeah.
How can I make sure that this is going to be an accessible site right from the start?
Well, there's lots of things that we can and should be doing to make sure that it's accessible, but automation is our friend, and we should definitely be leveraging that. There's a testing library, a testing suite that you can use called Axe Core. So like Axe, like the weapon, and Core, like your squishy middles, or your rock hard middles, whatever you're up to. So Axe Core, you can install directly with Playwright. It has like several hundred checkpoints that test against accessibility. It's automated, so it's not checking everything. It's just not really able to. For example, keyboard accessibility, you can't automate that kind of checks. But it can check, for example, that an image has alt text. It just might not know what the alt text is or if it's appropriate, kind of thing. Automation tends to capture around 20 to 30% of accessibility bugs. So it's not our one-fit solution, but you might as well have that safety net there. And it's a good way, no matter where your organization is on its accessibility journey, a really good way to make sure that there's that baseline accessibility there. So it's really, it works really compatible with Playwright. You can also make adjustments so that it's making exceptions to certain rules if you know that you have accessibility areas that you do or don't want to focus on, or you can exempt full pieces of code if you know that that's something that we know we need to work on and you don't want to be seeing the red all the time.
Yeah, so we're going to add a test now with that integration. We call it page has no accessibility issues. We're hooking into the Axe scanner. We're just going to pass in the page object and tell it to analyze it, and it's going to say expect it to have an empty array of the violations. Now, actually, as soon as I've added this in, it's failed. So what's going on here? Let's check out the error. Now, AxeCore gives us a whole bunch of data. You kind of have to scroll up to the top. You can see here in the description, it's saying ensure that the page, or at least one of its frames, contains a level 1 heading. What's a level 1 heading?
Right, so if we can switch to the slides as well. I've got slides, it's like I prepared. So headings are really important on a page for all sorts of users to understand what's going on. So as a sighted user, I would look at a page and scan it visually to get a sense of what's going on the page. To get a sense of what's going on the page. The same is true for people who have low vision or no vision, who also scan the headings. And they do that programmatically. So that's why we code things up with headings. I have on screen a screenshot of if a screen reader, they can pull up a window of all of the headings on the page, and so they can just briefly scan through all of that. So they'll either do it with a window like this, or they'll just do it in the browser itself and jump from heading to heading. So when we're talking about headings, visually, I have on screen like a drinks page. And so when I visually scan the page, I can get a sense of what this page is about, which is TDD drinks. We've got some products, and we've got some latest happenings. But if you look at the code, if we're just using a bunch of divs and spans, it doesn't really communicate that in the same way. All the content is there, but the HTML itself isn't communicating what the logic of the page is. As opposed to if we're using headings, and we're using headings properly and structurally, we start to get a clearer picture of what the headings are and what the different elements on the page are. And this is called semantic HTML. And we're going to be coming back to semantic HTML. Semantic means meaning, so using the meaning of HTML to define the meaning of the page. I might also say native HTML. That's the idea of using HTML like as it's intended to use. So if you're using a heading, make it a heading, that kind of thing. So if we take that structure and we just lay out the heading structure, you can get a sense of the logic of the page just by looking at the heading structure, right? We have the H1s, H2s, H3s all lined up, and we're not skipping any headings, and it's all in order. So this is what we see visually, but programmatically, people who are using screen readers, for example, this is what they're also, quote unquote, seeing. This is what they're perceiving as well. That's why this is really important. So where we can trip up when it comes to headings, and this is probably what we did in our university registration, is we often look at a design as developers. We look at a design and we say, okay, so we've got a big heading, TDD drink, so that's the biggest one, so I'll make that an H1 because it's big. And then the second biggest text is the product types and the events and news. That's the second biggest text, so I'll make that an H2. And then the third biggest ones is the product and whatever. Those are smaller, and they're actually kind of quite small, so I'll make them H4s because they're significantly smaller than the other ones. And so that's what ends up happening, breaking our heading structure, is that we're basing our HTML, the semantics, the meaning of the page, based on the visuals. And so we end up with a heading structure where we have an H1, but then we've skipped a bunch of headings to get to what we want. And this is, again, the structure that we saw before, but it's all broken. And so when a screen reader user is using this sample website, this is what they're perceiving. And it's a lot harder to make sense and understand the page like this. So coming back to our heading structure, we want to make sure that what the Axe core is saying is that every page needs to have one H1 because it has to be about something, and only one H1 because every page should only be about one thing. So I think we're going to go back, we're going to go back to that and make that correction.
Yeah. So when you get an error from Axe core, it's tempting to just go straight ahead and fix it. I don't recommend that because the Axe core errors are very vague. They're like catch-alls. What you want to do is you want to be more precise in your test inspection around like what are you looking for and why. So what I'm actually going to do is update that test looking for the heading and use a feature in Playwright that lets me say, okay, I'm going to get a heading and I'm actually going to request level 1 there. So I'm saying explicitly in this test, this should be my level 1 heading. And that way now I've got 2 tests failing. I've got my catch-all test from the Axe core and I've got a very precise test from the level 1 heading that we're looking for. So as you can imagine, pretty easy to fix this one up. We're going to switch it to an H1, and once the test cycle comes through, we're going to get all green again. How good is that? So,
Can I stop you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a question around my brain. I have written Playwright tests without Axe core. So what Axe core really does?
Yeah, so Axe core is just like, it will scan the page. So the question, sorry for the recording, is what does Axe core actually do? People have used Playwright to write tests without using Axe core. So what it adds for you is an automated scan. You do have to write a test to do it, so you have to set up the structure of the page that you want it to scan. In our case, we're just scanning the page once. Probably in a real system, we'd set it up so it auto scans on each transition to a new page. Or if you're dynamically adjusting the page, you might want to scan again. But it scans across the whole page and looks for like just a ton of known issues. This one about the heading, level 1 heading not existing is one of them. It can also look for like color contrast. So it can look at like the foreground, background color and tell you if there's not enough contrast. It'll look for a whole bunch of stuff, some of which we're going to get into as we go through the talk.
Playwright doesn't have such a capability?
Not natively, no. But Axe is an independent library and it's got adapters for a whole bunch of different frameworks. So one of its adapters is for Playwright. It's also got adapters for, I think, Selenium and Cypress and other things like that. But so Axe focuses on the accessibility and the other frameworks focus on the structure of writing your tests and executing like general page interactions. Yeah, cool. It's actually...
Once you're at it, so Visual Studio has sort of some integrated built-in tools. I think they're called Visual Studio Insights or Accessibility Insights or something like that. How does that actually compare with that?
So a lot of things are based on Axe core. A lot of automated tools are like Axe core is the kind of the industry standard, and it was like made open source. So it's basically a bunch of checkpoints, and Axe core is really reliable as well because it doesn't throw false negatives. So across in the industry, it's very popular. And then like a whole bunch of tools. Like if you ever have a vendor that's trying to sell you a platform for accessibility, they basically take an Axe core and then built additional tooling on top of it. Yeah. So. Yeah, and then I want to just comment about what is Axe core and how it's kind of playing with Playwright and how we're building on top of it. So this is a really simplistic example, but it's also a good example of how Axe core is good at, the automation is good at catching something. So it caught that the heading structure wasn't sound, but it can't tell us how to make it sound. Right, so that's where we have to go as engineers and maybe even asking our design teams, okay, this heading structure is broken, what should we do to make it fix? What is it that we're trying to communicate to the user? And that's how we work with automation.
Cool. So stepping forward now, we've done a few little basic interaction just to sort of demo the TDD style, write a test, make it pass, and to get familiar with Axe core. I did a little bit of refactoring of my tests because I had like localhost hard-coded, so I used a Playwright configuration to switch them back to just have like a base URL. And now we're going to actually start with the structure that we want to do, like the actual user interaction. So we're going to have a new test in a new spec file. Given I'm a registered student, when I enroll in a course, then I should be enrolled in that course. So this is a personal preference. I like to use Playwright's test step structure to separate out my given whens and thens. So I've got a test which is enrolling in a course, I've got test.step, test.step, test.step. It's just helpful for reporting and just like structuring the tests. And as you see later, you can sort of use that to use reusable structures. So it's kind of like BDD, but not using strict Cucumber syntax. There are some Cucumber integrations with it, but for simple things, I just sort of like to go with this. So when I'm starting, I'm not going to go and code up the whole interaction. I'm not going to go up and write a ton of lines of code in my test saying, you know, click this, do that, expect that, because I haven't built the page yet. I don't really know what's going to be there. So I just break it down one little thing at a time. So the very first thing is we're just saying, expect the page to have a combo box. Now, a combo box is the role, so it's called an ARIA role, that says, you know, what's the purpose of an element on the page, and the purpose of a combo box is something that allows you to select from multiple options. And so we're saying we want something that's going to allow us to select from multiple options. It needs to be visible, and the test is failing because we don't have any such thing yet. So let's get in here, sorry, back onto the page. And we've added a select element. So a select element is an instance of a combo box. Now I expected that to pass because I'm making it, I'm just looking for a combo box and now I've got a combo box, so why is it failing? Well, actually Axe has saved us again. Let's look at the error that it's telling us. It's saying, there's quite a lot here. Ensure that the select element has an accessible name. So this is one for you, Maia. What's an accessible name?
An accessible name is how assistive technology, so things like screen readers, Braille readers, voice activation, how they know what to call an element on the page. So for example, I have on screen the agenda page for the NDC conference. And when we look at it, there's lots of interactive elements on it, and I can go based on the name of it that I see, that's what the button should be called. So there's a menu, there's a hamburger menu with menu on it, and then we've got some agenda filter categories. They're all buttons, so I know what to call it. But for example, if I am using voice activation, I'm calling a button, if those names aren't there, then I don't know what to call the thing. Or rather, if it's not programmatically connected. So I might see something and want to call on it, but it doesn't have a programmatic name for that element. So all I'm going to know is that it's a link or it's a button, but I'm not going to know what that link or button is. If you look at the screen, you don't know what any of the things are. So this is what an assistive technology would interpret if it didn't have an accessible name. Now, accessible name is pretty easy to implement, actually. It's a lot of explanation for something pretty simple. It's the text on the button or the link that you would naturally put there, or it's the label when you put a for ID connection on an input. It's the alt text on an image. That's where elements get their name. So it's not actually that complicated to implement. Where we do see trip-ups, in specific instances. For example, we have an input field where the label is used as the placeholder. Don't get me started on placeholder text, but we have, for example, an input where there's no label connected to it because visually we're using the placeholder as the label. Or maybe we do have a label that's written there, but it's not programmatically connected. So visually we can see the label that says email, but programmatically under the hood, that label text hasn't been connected to the input. So assistive technology doesn't know that it's there. Another example is interactive elements. This is a really, really common issue that we find. So we have on screen an info button, so it's like a tooltip, right? So you might implement that as an image. And then you put an on-click function on it, but that image doesn't have a name. So again, assistive technology will land on it, or you implement it as a button with an on-click. But assistive technology will land on it, and it'll tell them that it's a button or it's an image, but they won't know what the thing is. So we want to use our regular practices to make sure that they have names. So what we've done, and what AxeCore is flagging to us, is essentially the first one, is that we created a select, which is an input type, but we didn't give it a name.
So what happens when that input has a label on top, which is a different element altogether? What would be the best practice there?
What do you mean? Say it again.
So if you got a label tag, right?
Yeah.
Label email,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then below that,
yeah.
Input tag,
yeah.
With the placeholder and no label,
yeah.
Right? So like you do have a label there for the email, but it's just on a different element on top.
Yeah. So.
What would be the best practice?
So a label with no connection to an input is just plain text. Yeah. So what you want, if you can go back to the slides for a second. The slide before, we have here, is there a laser on this? There is, yeah. So the input here, you want a for ID connection. So the label is for the ID of this one, and it matches the ID here. So that's what we call a for ID connection. Yeah.
Yep. So what we're going to do is go back to our test. So much like before, where we wanted to be explicit in our, not just in the AXCOR catch-all test, but in the test that's doing the thing that we want to do, we're going to update that test to say, well, we're looking for a combo box that has an accessible name of courses. And so now we're baking into our test the expectation that we have accessible names. And so this is by far and away the best way to find your elements on the page, with a combination of the role and the accessible name, because that's actually the user intention. That's what the user's looking for. Hands up if you've written a playwright test and you've found elements with some kind of XPath or some kind of CSS selector or maybe a data test ID selector. Yeah, a few hands going up. They're very convenient. They are terrible. They basically break this whole idea. Your test is no longer interacting with the page the way a user is. And so you don't give yourself the opportunity to discover or to sort of drive out, making it more accessible, but also you break the refactorability of your code, because those elements like the page structure, the DOM structure, the data test ID attributes, you should be free to change those without breaking your tests, because they're not user visible. They don't affect the contract of the page. But you can't if you coupled your tests to them. So if you want to express the tests at the contract level, you want to maximize refactorability of your code, expressing the element selectors based on the ARIA role and the accessible name is the best way to go. So we've added this now, and much like before, we've got two failures, the AXCOR error and the new thing because of looking for the name. And so let's go back and fix that up on the page. And just like the example Maia gave before, we've now got a label of HTML4 courses and select ID. So this is not strict HTML, this is React. So React doesn't like the word for because it's like, I guess, a conflict with JavaScript or TypeScript. So they've got HTML4 as the attribute if you're using React. But if it was just pure HTML, it would just be for. And now, scroll back down. Hey, all our tests are passing again. We've got the thing there. So now we're going to start adding a bit more functionality. We're going to say check for the existence of the actual course that we're looking for. So now we're not just asserting that it's visible, but we're saying get by role option with the name accessibility 101. So we're saying like it's hard-coded value that we're expecting on the page. We might change this later to be data-driven, but for now, this is a simple way to get started. And when you're doing TDD, I always start simple and then build up the complexity over time. So that's failing because we don't have any options. So let's go back to the page and add an option. And now we're getting that. And so we can actually, now we've got to the point where we can actually go and look at the page here, and you can see it doesn't look very fancy. It's got a whole bunch of Tailwind, has like removed all the default CSS. So we've just got the university registration heading, we've got the courses label, and a select box with just one option in it. So, you know, we're getting there, building it up piece by piece. Now we're looking for, we're expecting the courses list to have a value of an ID because we've looked for the option based on its accessible name, but when we're interacting with this kind of data, usually it's going to be data coming back from an API. It probably has an ID attached to it. So we're setting up a course ID with a hard-coded GUID, and we're saying we expect there to be an option with that name, but also we expect the list of courses to have a value as well. So an input value of that ID, which it doesn't yet. So let's go back in here, and we put that GUID on the value. Again, just hard-coding both sides. It's not a sin. We're just building this up piece by piece. This is kind of scaffolding that helps us get to the end result. And by doing it incrementally, step by step, we minimize our risk of failure and give ourselves nice checkpoints along the way. Now we're going to look for the submit button. So once again, we're going to learn our lesson and say we're looking for by role of button with name and role, and make sure that's enabled, which of course it isn't yet. So now let's add that in there. And we've got a button. And hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how this goes. Now we're asserting that after we click the button, we're going to find a cell with the name there. So we're going to show that after we click the button, we actually get something in an outcome that's been selected and the user has enrolled in the page. So that's failing because there's nothing there. And we're going to add a little bit more complexity here. So we're going to add like an on-click to call and enroll. We're going to start using some React use state to track the list of courses that we've enrolled in. We're just starting with a string for now to keep it simple. Eventually that'll evolve into an object. And we're creating a table with the list of enrolments mapped out in table rows. Now, it might seem a bit silly to use a table when we've just got like one field, but we're going to get more fields over time. And that's the thing about TDD. It's not so much about not doing things that, like you do want to make it simple and small, but it's okay to be aware of where you're going so that you can take steps in that direction. It's just don't make the steps too big. So we've added a table, and now our tests are passing again. First thing here is the table wasn't captioned. So what I mean by caption is the actual accessibility name of the table. So Maia showed before that like all different elements have different ways of defining their accessible name, and with tables the best way to do that is with a caption. So we've defined now that we're actually looking for this table with an accessible name of enrolments, and of course we don't have anything yet, so let's add that caption, and now the test will be passing again. And now we're going to be asserting on extra info about the enrolment. So this was a bit of a big chunk. I'm just going to talk you through it quickly. But when you're interacting with tables in this kind of style of trying to be more accessible, there's a temptation to just kind of go, oh, I know it's in the second column, or I know it's in the third column, let me just get it by the nth index of whatever. But I do recommend putting a little bit of effort into actually looking up the index of the heading and then doing the nth element with that index. So I've just done a simple implementation here to get it working, which of course is failing. And then we'll make it pass with another simple implementation. We're just hard-coding the headings at the top, the table row, and then putting in some hard-coded values. So immediately after we enroll, what we're saying is that the status is going to be submitted and the room is not yet allocated. Now, this is hard-coded for now because we haven't yet wired up the API, but it lets me start to build up the structure and be confident that it's going to sort of look the way that I want, but also that the accessibility characteristics are all there. So a little bit of refactoring in the test to create like a get table cell method, which is not too complicated, but just allows me to express the tests as get the table, make sure it's visible, get a row that has accessibility to 101 in it, make sure that's visible, and then get cells in the row that have the heading of course, heading of status, heading of room, and make sure they have that content. And now our tests are passing.
I get the concept there, right? But isn't that a lot of work?
Well, the first time...
Every single label, like the page could have a lot, you know what I mean? And like, it feels like, putting the word enrollment might take 2 minutes, but then you sort of times 3 or 4 just to do the testing against such a minute element.
Yeah, so the question is, isn't this a lot of work? It might seem like it. My experience is that it's not that much more work because you're doing it at the time that you're adding the element, and that's the best time to do it. It's a lot of work if you want to go back later and add it to the page when you've got 100 things on the page and you have to go and write tests and you're like, oh, I have to find all the elements and remember what they mean and add all of these tests for them. But when you're about to add the element and you literally just go, oh, I'm just going to add get by role table with this name, and then I add the thing, it's great. And the thing that's nice about this is it gives you this protective layer over time, because these labels are the contract. They're the contract that the user has with the page. When you do TDD in the back end, you think about contracts with classes and interfaces. When you're doing TDD with a front-end page, you don't have classes and interfaces, so you don't really have an explicit contract. But when you think about it, these accessible names are the contract, because that's what the user is looking for or perceiving for. So if we don't test these things and someone changes that heading later, we're not going to work out that actually we've broken the contract. If we have done our tests and we've been looking for like data test ID or a CSS class name or a DOM structure element, and someone changes the heading so it says the wrong thing, the tests are going to keep working because the structure hasn't changed, but actually we've broken the functionality that's important. We've broken the ability for the user to interact with the page and identify what they're looking for in the right way. So this kind of test, if you're going to write tests at all, I guess your question is like, this seems like a lot of work to do. Are you questioning the use of the accessibility name as the selector, or are you questioning the use of adding the test at all? Because if you're going to add tests, this is the way to do it. If you're not going to go add tests at all, well, I don't know what I could say to convince you of that, but I think that, over time you'll see as the tests build up, and especially they just build up in this little lightweight way. We add a little bit of test, a little bit of functionality. This one looked like a big chunk because I had to go and add that test, the table interaction stuff. Well, you've done it once, it's now a utility helper, you can reuse that over and over again. It'd be nice if Playwright had better table support, and there's an open GitHub issue on the Playwright project to improve support for interacting with tables. but they don't have that yet, so I just wrote a little simple one there myself. And now the test actually reads very cleanly. We're getting the table, we're getting the row, we're getting the courses and making sure that the right content is there. And if you're going to go and write a front-end test after the page has been built, which is what a lot of people do, you kind of end up writing this much test code anyway, because what's the spec? You've got to make sure the page is working. After we enroll, I want to see that the status is submitted and that the room is not yet allocated. So we're actually asserting on the functional behavior of the page. We're just using the accessibility roles to interact with the page, which is what protects the correct thing, in my opinion. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Have I convinced you? Not yet? Let's see.
Yeah, you got some answers, so yeah, that's okay.
Cool. Just for the record, he said it was a sound answer. That's for the record. Cool. So let's move forward a little bit. I'm going to skip through a bunch of this stuff because it's not so exciting from an accessibility perspective, and it's just sort of starting to, just clean up the page. But what I've done, I've extracted the enrolling form into its own sort of React component. And the nice thing is the tests just keep passing. So this is refactorability in action, what I'm talking about, because none of the tests assert on the structure, the DOM structure, the React structure, anything like that. So now I'm just cleaning up my HTML. So I've got an enrolling form component and an enrollments component, which is now sort of encapsulating that table because it just was starting to get too clunky. And these are just refactoring steps. The tests keep passing, so I know the functionality is still correct. And actually I'm going to extract all of it into an enrolling component that contains the enrolling form and the enrollments. And I'm doing this because in preparation, I know that this enroll handler, the click handler, like the callback here, is going to get more and more complex, so I'm just putting that in its own component. And the page now is pretty straightforward. It's just the heading and the enrolling component. And you can imagine now how this would grow into like a multi-page app with a component per page. A few more refactoring steps. I'm just going to skip through these because I don't think it's too exciting. One thing that's interesting in the tests is we're going to start parameterizing them. So in Playwright, the way that you parameterize is literally just put like a for loop and actually embed the data into the name of the test. So here we've got all courses as an array of courses with names and IDs, and we're saying tests that put inside a for loop, we're running the test. So we put a test describe around the whole thing, which sort of groups all of the tests for each parameter. We've got a test for each element in the course, so each course, and then we've got all of our test steps here. The other thing that we've added through a couple of these steps is we've introduced page route, which is like a mock of the API call, so that we can start to assert that we're getting stuff back from the API. Now, this is all very interesting to me. It's good practice from a TDD perspective, but it's probably pretty standard stuff for you if you build front-end apps, so I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail today. But now we've just made it pass so that we've got like a use effect to fetch the courses, and we're actually passing those courses into the enrolling form. And so now the enrolling form will start to render those course names into the select option. At the moment it's just doing one, but we're going to add a few more things here to loop over those elements eventually. So now we're sort of doing a courses map to add an option for a course and get that into the thing. So, like I said, just going to skip through a couple of these steps. It's all in the GitHub if you want to check it out later. But the reason we're doing this is to sort of jump ahead to what's going to be a little bit more interesting from an accessibility perspective, which is actually the input validation. So, one thing I will note here is that we get to a point where once the functionality is all starting to build up, that's when I start to do the visual styling. So up until that point, as I showed you before on the page, it was looking pretty clunky. Let me go back here. So this is not exactly like usable from a sighted user's perspective, because we've been focusing on the accessibility interactions. Someone using a screen reader, this would be perfectly usable and fine, but we actually do have to cater to all our users. So let's do some styling here, but I always do the styling in separate steps. I'm going to start adding a bunch of Tailwind class names, visual layout of the enrollments lists, and so on. So now let's go back in there and check it out. I mean, look, I'm not a designer. It doesn't look amazing, but at least there's some structure to the page now. You can see we've got university registration, the courses are there, and you can click enroll, and it'll come up in this table down here. And obviously, if you're doing this for real, you'd be working with a designer, getting some nice colors and padding and whatnot, but at least now we can actually use the page.
And again, like Chris said, we're constantly preserving the accessibility throughout. So now that we're applying styling, our styling is not breaking that structure that we built already.
And we know that because the tests are all still green, and the tests were written with that accessibility characteristics in mind, which is awesome. So now we're going to get into testing the input validation. So if you interact with the page at the moment, there's no input validation. You're allowed to click enroll, even though you might not have selected anything, and then the enroll handler is just going to kind of handle it here and say, look for the course that matches the ID that was selected, and if I can't find it, just return an empty string. So I'm not really doing anything smart about that. Now, in order to do this testing, one thing that I think is quite helpful is Playwright is optimized around like the full page testing. So you got to load the whole page up, and you got to construct the scenario to get the page to look the way you want it to, and then do the assertions, which I think you definitely need that for at least sort of one, like the happy path interaction on every single page. But once you get into things like input validation and other sort of more complex interactions, it can be easier to work at a lower level, specifically with components. So there are a whole bunch of testing frameworks out there to support like React component testing, like React testing library. In this case, because we're working in Playwright, I actually wanted to check out, and I quite enjoyed it, an experimental thing called Playwright component testing, which is part of the Playwright suite, but is optimized for using the Playwright mechanisms. But what it does under the hood for you is you can just give it a component, and it will sort of mount that component into an isolated page and allow you to interact with that component on its own. So it allows you to sort of, especially if you've built a component that just has data passed in and callbacks out, that's a very nice way of testing that component in isolation. So we've added Playwright component testing as a library, and now we're going to add a simple component test. So the components are here, enrolling form. You can see here the way it works is we create our own sort of callback in the test. We say the form is, we call mount, which comes from the Playwright component testing. We pass in the form, and then we can actually use like Playwright stuff like get by role on that component. We can interact with it with a click, and we can expect things to be equal there. And so this is all still passing, because in this case I've written a test that just asserts the same behavior I already had at the page level test. I just wrote this to sort of validate that the component test infrastructure was working.
Chris,
Yeah.
is Playwright rules of using get by role, for example, different is in React and in Angular? Because I have used it with Angular, and in Angular I noticed if I want to use get by role, I have to have a real role. Otherwise, I have to use get by ID, for example. So
Right.
I can see you use get by role even for IDs, right? Even for those components that don't have a real role, just have ID.
So every element, every HTML element
Has a technical role.
role.
Yeah.
There is a way to override that with the ARIA role attribute, but it's recommended generally not to use that, and to use the semantic or the native HTML element for the role that you want. So I'll have to have maybe we'll chat about that later.
Do you want to show in the browser how you can find the role?
Yeah, and it's an HTML thing. It's not a React or an Angular thing. So I'd be surprised if it didn't work in Angular as well. But I can't definitively answer that question for you.
HTML, like, because I was writing a test for a code that I didn't write, and some components had a real role, and some components didn't.
Right.
Some component came with class or ID or name. So I had to adjust it, and then for some component, get by role wasn't working, so I had to go use get by ID, for example. So
Yeah, so the question is that for some...
are using it interchangeably, even for like, in the HTML I could see you have ID or name, and then it's working.
Yeah, well, so try not to use the ID at all other than when it's needed for like the label attachment, so label for ID. Or I use the ID on the input elements, because that becomes part of the ID and the name for the form input data. But for the tests, almost never use an ID to find an element.
But sometimes I had to.
Yeah, so the question was sometimes I had to.
It wasn't working because there was no area role.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So let's pull this up. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, I'm struggling to find it. But there is in the browser inspector tools. Had it literally up just before. This is the beauty of live demos, right? Does anyone remember in Safari, where is the accessibility characteristics? select object here. That's all the styling.
What's the gear do? Does it show us
This one.
more options? No, never mind, sorry. I'm not familiar with Safari.
This is very embarrassing. Still grid layouts and so on.
I know in Chrome it's just an accessibility
Yeah.
tab,
Yeah, exactly.
a bit easier to find.
Let's load this up in the browser's running the thing. That's what we're doing in Safari. Literally was looking at it this morning. Is it here? No, this is an accessibility audit. Might have to come back to this one later, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe after the talk we'll have a quick look for it. But in the browser, if you go into the DevTools, you should be able to find an accessibility heading, which will tell you all the accessibility characteristics. So the accessible name and the implicit role, and it'll also tell you if you've overridden the role. All HTML elements, I believe, have a technical role.
Yeah,
I had.
I could see it in HTML anyway, so in the code I had, I could see it in HTML, for example, so like class and ID and then area role.
Okay, but it was just Playwright wasn't getting it by role.
Pardon?
You were saying that Playwright wasn't.
It's Angular. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's the difference between Angular and React or.
I wouldn't think that there should be a difference between Angular and React because Playwright is interacting with the HTML via the browser, so it shouldn't care how the HTML got there. So yeah. Anyway, we might chat about that. So now we've got a component test though. We're going to interact with the component, and the first thing we're going to do is say that, well, if you haven't selected a course, then you should expect it to not enroll anything. So it says, the enrolled course should be null. So the enrolled course we're getting here, we're passing in a callback. The callback is just sort of capturing the course that was passed in the callback, and we're expecting it to be null. But at the moment, it's still passing back a course because we haven't built any functionality in our enrolling form to handle that. And so what's actually happening is in the enroll callback, as before, it's always passing back a course object, but it would just have like null data in it. So to make this thing pass, we're going to be a bit smarter about it. We say, well, actually, if there's no course ID in the thing, then we just return and not return a course value, and now the test is passing. The next thing we're going to do is test that there's a validation message, enrolling form component. Now, browsers have native validation messages. The way that we find that is by using Playwright Evaluate, which actually lets us interact directly with the HTML input element, and we can get the validation message property off it. And at the moment, we're just expecting it to not be the empty string, but it is currently the empty string. So let's go back in and fix that. And the way that we do that is by literally just putting this required attribute. So this is kind of a semantic HTML native validation property. So that required attribute activates the native browser validation, and now the test is passing. So we can actually go back and look at this. If I click enroll now, it says select an item in the list, hovers over that, and that's just the native default browser. That's not exactly the experience we want, so let's write a test that actually, we're going to do a visual aid to sort of add a pink background if it's invalid, and then So this is pretty good, right, Maia? This is enough for our validation message.
I don't know.
Pink goes pink.
What do we think?
Does select an item in the list.
Do we think that has all the accessibility features that we want? No. Okay. So when it comes to error validation, and this is, again, an area where automation can't totally detect this, right? So error messages, we want two things when it comes to error messages, because they're really, really important. So the first stop is that we want to communicate it in text, because text everybody can perceive. whether you're able to see or not see, whether you're able to see color or not, whether you have low vision, some vision, whatever it is, text everybody can interpret. So we want to make sure that it's always in text. So in this case, we have an email field. And when when it went pink, so we're indicating using color on our thing. And in this example, I have it, the outline goes red. But not everybody can see red or pink. In fact, that's the most common color blindness is red-green, right? So using color is still important, definitely for sighted visual people. We really want to be using color. We just want to be using text as well. So instead of having just that red outline or just that pink background, we want to make sure that we're adding text in addition to that. So in the example that we still have that red outline, but we also have text saying the email is invalid. Now you might be saying, okay, well in the browser that we had the pop-up that came up that was the text, right? So the second thing that we want to ensure when it comes to error messages is that it's persistent. Because what happens is if you're filling out a form and you've got errors, and our form is simple that there's just the one error, but you have a form with multiple errors in it, you might see those errors come up at first, but then if they disappear, what's the issue then, right? You might have that color indication, which you may or may not be able to see, but otherwise you've lost the other indicator, the text indicator, which has two impacts. One is I might not even know that field is an error anymore because I can't perceive that red outline. And two, maybe I do know that it's an error, but I don't know why. I don't know what's wrong, right? Like, I don't know that my email address is missing a period, so I'm reading it over and over, and I can't tell what's wrong with it because that error message, the text, is not persistent. So going back to what we had before on the screen, we had a message in text, but it wasn't persistent, and we were just relying on color otherwise. So, Chris, if we can make some updates to our error message to follow those two principles.
There again, you use the for ID to link the error message with the input.
Yeah, so you would use aria described by,
The aria, yeah.
and you put aria described by on the input. And what that means is that when a screen reader, for example, screen reader user tabs to that input field, it'll read out the label and then it'll read out the error message right away, so that they don't have to kind of navigate around the form, especially a form, because oftentimes, just like if you're not using screen reader, you're often just tabbing through. Screen reader users are also doing the same, so connecting them programmatically with an aria described by is what we want to be doing. Yeah.
So we've expressed that in the test here. This is the only time I use like an ID locator, but it's dynamic, because what I'm doing is I'm getting the selector, we're doing get attribute aria described by, and then we are looking for an element that has the ID that's contained in the aria described by attribute. So still very much the programmatic approach. And then we're expecting at the start for the validation message to be hidden, and after we click the enroll button, we're expecting the enrolled course to be null. We're expecting the native validation message to be there as well, but we're also expecting the validation message now to be visible and to have the text, please select the course to enroll in. So it's red because we haven't done any of that. So let's go in and see what it looks like to make that work. So we've now added an on-invalid handler, which is up here, which we do prevent default to stop it from submitting, and we set invalid true. And then we now have if is invalid and ampersand a div block with the course errors. Please select the course to enroll in. Aria described by course errors here. So that ties this error message to, or this container, this div container, to the errors associated with that select combo box. And we're only displaying it when it actually is invalid, which we're setting with this React handler use state. So hopefully
And
this,
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing that I like that we have the test for it is that, so this might be new information for some people in the room about the aria described by and the error messages. And with accessibility, we're learning all the time. So using tests is a great way to institutionalize that knowledge. So you just learned that. So you can write the tests so that when the code passes through different hands, when you move on to another piece of code and somebody else takes this up, they're not going to start messing with it because it's written right there, and you don't have to write a bunch of notes in the code itself. You have the tests that reflect the accessibility knowledge there, and you've institutionalized that knowledge.
So now we have, if I reload the page, we're going to enroll with that before we've selected the course. we now get this validation message. It's got a pink background, so it's nice for visual readers. It's got the persistent message, and it's there. So this should do everything you want, right?
Yeah, okay, so I lied when I said that we have 2 things. We actually have 3 things that we need to think about. So we have, in text, check, and it's persistent, check, so that we've accomplished those things. What about our non-sighted users? When you get an error message, visually I can see that the error message showed up, and I think I have slides for this one as well. Basically it says the same thing. Visually I can see the error show up, and that to me is the indicator that there's an error message. But if you can't see it, then how do you know? And so we have a notification, basically. It's not a notification, it's called a live region, or a role equals alert or role equals status. That's called a live region. And that alerts to assistive technology, hey, pay attention over here, something happened, something has changed, and you need to announce it so that the user knows. So the third thing we want to do is that we want to make sure that we're communicating to all users. So if we can do that, Chris.
Yeah, well, and we can actually have it prepared here, if this works, to show you what it feels like to be a screen reader on this page at the moment.
VoiceOver on Safari, University Registration, window, University Registration, web content has keyboard focus.
Yep.
Registration. Select the course you'd like to enroll in. Enroll button.
I submitted, I got the visual error message, no screen reader alert. So obviously not ideal. A screen reader user would be wondering, what's going on with this? Why haven't I got my content? So how do we...
Chromium, code, in VoiceOver off.
We don't remember to turn that one off.
The number 1 key for playing with screen readers, which you definitely should, it's really interesting and fun, is know how to turn it off.
Okay, so we're going to add a test now, which says, well, our validation message is not enough that it's just visible and it has that text, but it should have the role of alert. And that's all we have to do. We just have to add this alert role to the page. So now it's failing because we haven't got that alert role. And if we go back to the page, we can make it pass just by, so on the side here, role equals alert. That's all we have to do. Simple thing. But now, as Maia said, it's baked into the test, it's institutional knowledge, and our tests are all going green now. You'll see we've actually got, I should have pointed this out before, we got separate test runs for 9 tests for the main playwright test, then 2 tests for the component test. So there's one thing with playwright component testing, because it's a bit experimental, it's like 2 separate test runs, but my auto reload loop is running both of them.
So, quick question. Did Axel Core indicate that it was missing the role?
No, and that's again the limitation of automation, because it doesn't have the context. It doesn't know that it knows that there's an invalid, but it doesn't know that it needs an alert on it. It doesn't know how it's been communicated. So yeah, so that's where training and education and then institutionalizing that knowledge comes in. So Axe Core and automation is a baseline, and then we use our knowledge and skills and training on top of that. Yeah. You're here. No, that's not at all. You're here.
Yeah, but I wouldn't have known that.
No, and that's totally fair, and that's why this is my full-time job, right? But that's why you're here, is that you're learning this, and also that you're passing on the knowledge through your code as well, so that the person behind you, the next person who's going to touch the code, won't know it either. But this is a way that you can influence the code to make sure that it's there. Yeah.
So let's see what this actually does now.
VoiceOver on Safari, University. Select the course you'd like to enroll in. Course enroll button. Please select the course to enroll in.
So you added the voice only just by adding the role alert?
So he's using a screen reader, VoiceOver. So he turned on the screen reader, and then it was reading the whole page. Is that what you mean?
Oh, is it on Safari? Or
Yeah. Well, so the screen reader I'm using is the Mac OS VoiceOver screen reader, so it's baked into the Mac operating system.
Is it only on Mac?
No. So every computer and device has a screen reader available to it. So Macs have it built in. It's called VoiceOver. Your phone has a screen reader built in as well. No matter if
enrollments, VoiceOver off.
Yeah. So so your phone has a screen reader, whether it's Android or iPhone. You have it built in, and it's really cool and fun to play. Again, know how to turn it off, but you should definitely play with it. And so basically. And then if you have a Windows or a Linux machine, you just install it. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's not, depending on which one you go with. A screen reader is a software. basically. So it's not a hardware piece that you're adding to your computer, it's software that you turn on, basically. And Chris is just using his regular laptop, and it just adds a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, essentially. So he can still tab around, and that's what he was doing. But if you're a more sophisticated screen reader user, you know a whole bunch of shortcuts so that you can scan the page by headings, for example. So you hit H, and then it starts reading all the headings. You can browse by links and buttons and all that kind of stuff. So it adds this whole other keyboard shortcuts kind of thing. Yeah.
So the paradigm in Folklore is the alert there. I saw you up the alert role.
Mm-hmm.
But how did the voiceover knew that, in a responsive page, so for example, if you're using something like Signal R, for example, with Blazor server, and you've got sort of that WebSocket running and that very highly responsive, how did that web server know that the state changed and hence it is to prompt the user?
Because that's the role of alert. That's the purpose of role equals alert. It's called a live region. So it's saying this region here is.
You've got to look at it all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the voiceover is it keeps monitoring if you change it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And just now that we've got this working, I do want to just do a quick demo as well. This is the voiceover utility settings. We've got it on the default speed of 45. But a lot of screen reader users will have it turned up to 100.
100, the best way to predict the future is limited.
And literally we'll be browsing the page like this.
Voiceover on Safari, University Registration, window, University Registration, web content, keyboard focus.
Once you get yourself trained up and you use it a lot, that's perfectly intelligible. And when you work with people who use screen readers, I've sat next to them while they're doing it, and it's absolutely amazing. They're so capable, they're able to navigate the page with ease, as long as you've taken the time to set the page up in the right way. And if you do that, you're doing them a massive service. So don't disregard the significance and impact of being able to make these changes to the page.
Yeah, nice.
In Australia, why don't we have requirements that websites have accessibility?
We do.
US
Yeah, so the question is about requirements. In Australia, we do have requirements like the US. It's not as stringent as the US, and the US, they sue a lot, and same with Europe. So there's just a lot more publicity in the US because of that suing culture. In Europe, there's the standards are a lot stricter for both private and public sectors, and Canada as well. So internationally, so if you work in an organization that is international, they have to pay a lot more attention to accessibility because those legislations are there. There are still in Australia, particularly for government has to meet accessibility requirements. And there was just a recent update from the Discrimination Act that said exactly that. And so that's required for government, so yeah. We're working in the public sector.
So we have to wrap up pretty quickly, I think. Yep.
Yeah, so thank you all for your patience. So let's bring it all together. We started off talking about that too hard bucket, and hopefully we knocked that over a little bit. And not only that, we kind of explored what's inside of that bucket. When it comes to accessibility, we talked about the 5 million people at a minimum who we are catering to. But we also know that there's more, like I said, than just those 5 million people that we are making our apps usable for them. And what's really cool as well is that we're doing it at this MVP early stage, right? It's not that thing that we're going to do at the end, that we'll do it next time, we'll come back to it. Right from the beginning, accessibility is built in. That's really cool. Not only that, because then you get benefits from it as well. When the disabled community represents $30 billion in Australia, so your organization will be taking advantage of that. 28% of organizations that are companies that are mature in accessibility see 28% higher revenues than those that don't invest in their accessibility. So these are the advantages that the business is seeing by focusing on human-centered approaches like accessibility.
And from a TDD perspective, the thing that I've found since adopting this practice is that when my playwright tests interact with the page in the same way that my users do, that makes the code way more refactorable You saw me pulling components out with ease. You saw me making drastic changes without a concern because the test had me covered and they were actually interacting with the page in the same way that a user does. And we can only do that because the accessibility APIs are there to support the screen readers and we're hooking into the same things. So they really are a perfect partnership.
And by focusing on human-centered products and code, we're able to accomplish things like TDD and accessibility, or use accessibility and TDD in order to create human-centered software. And that's us.
That's the code. If you want to check out the history, all the stuff we skipped through, check it out on GitHub there. Otherwise,
that's us. Thank you so much.
take your time.
Oh, sorry. I'll go back so you can have a look at the code base. And then after that, I'll show you please connect with us and come talk to us as well. I also have stickers if you want stickers. Come get stickers. Thank you so much for your great questions and your attentiveness. Thank you.
Thank you.